What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is another episode of the best armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated lists from the last week of competitive events and talk about what is winning in the competitive 40k metagame. Now, this is going to be an interesting week because this weekend saw the Las Vegas Open, the largest single event in Warhammer 40k of the year with over 1,000 players. Now, I have an entire video specifically talking about the LVO results, at least the top 8 cut and the lists that made up the cut if you want to go check that out. So we won't be discussing LVO in too great a detail in this video specifically. However, the event does sort of overshadow a lot of the weekend, with many competitive players traveling to that event rather than attending other GTs. Sometimes we see this manifest in a lower number of GTs on the LVO weekend, but we do have quite a bit to talk about this time around. So with that in mind, let's dive in and discuss a metagame breakdown. Now, Space Marines are the big headliners of the weekend. Spoiler alert, they did take down the Las Vegas Open, with the finals being both a compliant and non-compliant chapter fighting against one another, those being Ultramarines and Deathwatch. And we also saw them do fairly well, both in compliant and non-compliant archetypes elsewhere around the world. This included 2 undefeated results at New Year's Knockout, the Burn and Learn GT, and Las Vegas Open for Ultramarines. We also saw Dark Angels go undefeated at the Hamburg Major, and obviously Deathwatch, as I mentioned before, taking down the Las Vegas Open champions. In addition, we're also seeing Chaos Demons do fairly well with their Legion of Excess detachment, with 2 undefeated results, one at the First Assault, the other one at the Dutch Masters Finale. Grey Knights took down the Cross Swords Vigil of Peace. Necrons also going undefeated alongside Dark Angels at the Hamburg Major. World Eaters taking down the Iberian Open Mogware. Death Guard also undefeated at the Dutch Masters Finale. And Astra Militarum taking down the Abyss Bonne Année. Now, at the time of recording, there are other events that are still ongoing, and we don't have final results for them. If they complete it by the time I start editing this video, then I'll include them in this metagame breakdown. But as it stands, it's 11 p.m. when I'm recording this, and I want to go to sleep at some point. So unfortunately, I won't be discussing those results in this recording. Now, if you want to watch some of the coverage from this weekend, most of it was focused on the Las Vegas Open. Both Wargames Live and Tabletop Live traveled over to that event to live stream it, and we got some incredible coverage from both of those channels. Tons and tons of games of Warhammer 40k to sift through. The official Warhammer Twitch channel, you can find at twitch.tv/Warhammer, was also there live streaming over the course of the weekend. They also live streamed the 40k Champions final. So lots of games from the LVO to watch, although to my knowledge, I don't believe any other channels were live streaming events this weekend, but if anyone knows of any that were live, go ahead and throw them in the comments so we can get some eyes on their coverage. And as always, I want to thank everyone who supports Tactical Tortoise and helps me make these videos. You can support me either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, over on my YouTube channel membership. You can join in the link down below the video, as well as Twitch subscribers. You can visit me on Twitch at twitch.tv/TacticalTortoiseTV, where I showcase most of my 40k gameplay. All of you people help me keep the lights on over here and help me continue to do what I do, so I really appreciate it. And with that, let's dive in and start talking about some event results. Now we're going to start with the current meta frontrunner Ultramarines and move over to the New Year's Knockout at the Keep in Kent, Washington. The event was taken down by Colin Sherman, who was running a Librarius Conclave, hence why we're talking about this list. No Gladius task forces or Vanguard spearheads here. We're going to talk about some cool wizard boys. This was being led by Chief Librarian Tigurius. This guy's obviously a huge benefit, and alongside the other characters that you get from Ultramarines, of running Ultramarines in this detachment. He gives his unit a stealth effect, as well as free use on stratagems, especially things like Overwatch, which is great, but I think most importantly, he also gives you just a really powerful ranged attack that you can bring to bear, alongside that Psyker keyword, which is important for this detachment. We're running a standard Librarian with Fusillade to give his unit anti-monster anti-monster, anti-vehicle, as well as sustained hits, a Phobos Librarian, as well as a Terminator Librarian with celerity to allow his unit to advance and charge. We then have a big, heavy Intercessor squad. Now, interestingly, those Intercessors are battle line, and down on the bottom here, we do have an Inquisitor in the army, Inquisitor Draxus. She can potentially make those guys unshootable from outside 18 inches, as well as providing them a nice hit buff when targeting Xenos units, and obviously her own powerful shooting as well. Once that is stacked on top of all of the other benefits that you can gain from having a Psyker in your units in this detachment, it's definitely worth including her. And it is an interesting interaction that the Psyker Inquisitors will contribute all of the necessary keywords to one of these units to provide them the benefits of the detachment ability. We then have a standard Intercessor squad for some objectives secured, some backline shooting provided by 2 Ballistus Dreadnoughts, a Blade Guard veteran squad likely for Tigurius to join into, an Incursor squad. This may be where the Phobos Librarian is going. Downside here, obviously, is that the Phobos Librarian does remove the unit's scout, unfortunately, when he attaches, although he does make them unshootable, so they're able to provide their hit bonus through most of the game without really being interrupted by enemies. We have a Repulsor in here as well, and that is likely to carry around our Stern Guard veteran squad. So what we can do here with the Stern Guard veterans, these guys are equipped with their bolt rifles and heavy bolters, is gain sustained hits and anti-monster, anti-vehicle from Fusillade, Oath of Moment the target, so the Stern Guard veterans get full hit and wound rerolls, shoot them with an Incursor unit so that you get +1 to hit against it, and then they can fish all of their hit rolls to try to get additional hits unsustained, and then fish all of those wound rolls to try to get 5-up criticals to then inflict mortal wounds. The full combination active is probably somewhere around 12 to 16 mortals once all of these benefits are applied. We then have a big Terminator Assault Squad to act as another big mid-board bulwark alongside that Celerity Terminator Sorcerer. This army is fairly light on utility units. We do have a lot of big bricks in the army, including things like this heavy Intercessor squad, the Blade Guard veterans, and the Terminators, so it is very aggressive and in your face. It does seem like it is maybe a little bit low on scoring, but obviously that weakness can be shored up by simply just killing all of your opponent's units and dominating the center of the table with all of these powerful and resilient units. Very cool to see a creative build like this come out of Librarius Conclave. I do love that we are playing a little bit more creative detachments in Ultramarines. It is a good thing, I guess, about the Space Marine buffs is that it did allow a lot of non-standard archetypes to see play. When you're +1 to wound on basically your whole army and you have a bunch of super powerful characters to work with, it's definitely easier to build creative lists like this in a faction like Ultramarines, but I do appreciate that that is a knock-on effect. Now with that, we're going to move on over to Chaos Demons and talk about some Legions of Excess. Now, coming off of its win at the Nottingham Super Major, all of the demon results that went undefeated this week were using that detachment, but we had a really interesting one from over here in Finland for the first Assault GT. Juuso Shipilainen went undefeated with a Legion of Excess army, and the interesting part about this is that he was actually running Be'lakor. Now, I really like the combination of Be'lakor within this detachment. He is wildly expensive, and he unfortunately doesn't benefit from the detachment abilities. However, he has so much internal synergy with Legion of Excess that it might be worth including anyway. He can make your army unshootable, which forces your opponent to come closer to you into the threat range of your very fast Slanesh units. The detachment doesn't have any way to naturally speed up its movement besides making its mobility a little easier, so setting the line of engagement much closer to your army is hugely beneficial to you. You can also make that really awkward alongside their stratagem to force enemies to retarget attacks off of them if they fail battle shock checks, because you can potentially make it very difficult for them to bring any relevant targets within 18 inches to then successfully retarget. So failing that battle shock check could potentially just force them to not shoot at all. He also can potentially give you rerolls on your own battle shock checks. So when you're forcing your army to take battle shock checks to heal itself, he can potentially make those much easier to succeed and thereby allow you to heal more wounds. It's a lot of synergy, although obviously he is a very expensive piece for that synergy. Now, in addition to him, we're taking a Keeper of Secrets with the Soul Glutton to heal some wounds once it kills people, and Celeste as well as a strong independent operator. We have a unit of Plague Bearers as well as 3 units of 3 Fiends. A lot of MSU energy in this army. These are just smaller units of Fiends, not the big bricks of 6 that we're typically seeing. 2 individual Seeker Chariots, which are really interesting. These are one of the most efficient utility units in Demons. The downside has been traditionally that mounted keyword. They are not very good at maneuvering around walls, but with the ability to go through walls with the stratagem, these Seeker Chariots can be a lot more maneuverable and can actually act as very, very strong utility. They're also very good at infantry sweeping. They have 1 trillion attacks for their points value, and while they are only low strength and low damage infantry sweeping attacks, for 65 points, being able to basically pick up 10 infantry models pretty reliably is a big deal for these things. Following that up, we have 2 units of 5 Seekers, so a lot of mid-board control with those long scouts, as well as a trio of Slaaneshi Soul Grinders. Now, the Soul Grinders also benefit from Be'lakor quite a bit as well. Be'lakor enjoys palling around with units that can shoot effectively because he can make it easy for you to shoot at your opponent, then movement block them into their position so that they can't move within his 18-inch bubble of lone operative. If they're then not able to get within 18 inches of the units that are shooting them, like the Soul Grinders, they can't fire back, and the Soul Grinders can just do it again. Not to mention the fact that the Soul Grinders are incredibly strong in melee, especially once you have performed a Seductive Gambit to give yourself wound-free rolls. These things will crush through heavy armor, whereas Be'lakor, and as obviously the Seeker Chariots, give you a good out for infantry. He has excellent sweep and anti-infantry shooting attacks. Those Seeker Chariots, as well as the Seekers and the Fiends, are also good at killing both light and medium infantry, and the Soul Grinders can crush through your army. So that creates a very nicely well-rounded variety of units, and they synergize very well with the inclusion of this incredibly expensive epic hero. I decided to talk about this list because it's very cool. I think it's a little bit more of a non-standard build for Legion of Excess, but it goes to show that I think that there is still some build variety, even in what looks otherwise to be a very straightforward detachment where you're just going to be windmill slamming these powerful Slaanesh melee units into your army. Now with that, let's go ahead and discuss some Grey Knights. We're going to move over to the United Kingdom to talk about the Cross Swords Vigil of Peace. This was a 36-player event and was won by Jonathan Summerfield, running a Warpbane task force. Interestingly, Jonathan elected to take some, I guess, non-standard characters for the task force. He included 2 Brotherhood Librarians, which we don't typically see inside Warpbane. These are very much a popular inclusion for Teleport Strike Force when that was still widely played back in the day. However, they do still provide an immense amount of mortal wound output, which is excellent for the army. So we're including 2 of those guys alongside 2 Nemesis Grandmasters. No enhancements on any of those units. 1 Strike Squad for OBSEC and a little bit of scouting. 3 standard Nemesis Dread Knights just equipped with Gatling Silencers, Heavy Side Cannons, and Great Hammers, alongside 2 Purgation Squads. These guys are all equipped with standard Psy Cannons. This is a very popular evolution of Warpbane Task Force that has been being experimented with over the last couple of weeks. These Purgation Squads getting full hit rerolls when just standing in your deployment zone can offset the downside that they have when firing indirectly. As long as you can see your target with any other Psyker in your army, that allows the Purgation Squads to fire at them from out of line of sight. And the Psy Cannons give you good access to a little bit of light or medium infantry clearing. One downside of Warpbane Task Force is that it can be screened fairly effectively because it's very teleport focused. Basically, what it wants to do is put purifiers up close and personal with you, and then use those to teleport in your other units, or at the very least use its Nemesis Dread Knights to advance up the table, but that is capable of being move blocked in this detachment, because unlike Teleport Strike Force, they don't get fly when they go to advance. So a high volume of enemy infantry that are able to kind of bubble wrap the table can prevent you from getting your charges out of Deep Strike onto your opponent's important units. The Purgation Squads allow you to clear out those units without having to commit your bigger and scarier models so that your opponent can't hit you back in response. Now, a classic combination alongside this is Interceptors. What you can do potentially is move the Interceptors out, fire with the Purgation Squads first to clear out whatever the Interceptors are looking at, then fire with the Interceptors last and move them back into safety so none of your army has to expose itself in order to allow those Purgation Squads to get value. Downside, obviously, is that they're very expensive, so that entire combination is super pricey. dicey, but it does give you a lot of benefits in Warpbane Task Force. We're not doing that today. We're just going to be using those Purgation Squads in more of a standard capacity, but we can use those Brotherhood Librarians to teleport in and act as spotters for those Purgation units. Now, in addition to that, we're also running a Calidus Assassin, so we have a little bit more uppy-downy as well. And obviously, we are running a couple of Purifier Squads because that's kind of the whole deal with this detachment. That includes 2 Purifier Squads, just of 5 models apiece, these guys equipped with Psy Cannons. I think that means that these guys are going to be being used in a much more support capacity than we typically see them. This detachment is able to push the damage output of Purifier Squads through the absolute roof, but the fact that we're focusing on the heavy or special weapons in these units speaks to me that they're just going to be acting as hallowed ground auras where they can teleport around alongside your Dread Knights to keep rerolls up with them or to allow your infantry to close deep strike with the enemy without putting themselves in too much danger. Now with that, we're going to move over to Germany and discuss the 2 undefeated results from the Hamburg Major. Now this event was a 100-player major level event and ended up with 2 undefeated players, both at 5-0. It did use differential scoring, so we do have 2 X0-1 results at the end here, both Death Guard and Necrons going X0-1 at that event, but we aren't going to be discussing those armies right now, just the 2 lists that went 5-0. Now the first one is Jens Bothur, who is running Necrons in a Starshatter arsenal. Now, I don't know whether or not this event was using the new updated CP costs and stratagems for Starshatter arsenal. It did get nerfed so that many of its stratagems are more expensive or less effective. I imagine that it didn't because that only occurred last week, so I would operate under the assumption that the list lock for this event was before that January update that I discussed in my video when that came out. In this army, Jens was running a Hexmark Destroyer with Chrono Impedance Fields to reduce incoming damage on a target, a second Hexmark Destroyer just as a utility unit, Imhotep the Stormlord to grant CP back to the army so it can fuel its massive number of powerful stratagems, a Locust Lord with Demanding Leader to allow units to fall back and shoot alongside the Silent King. We then have a Canoptech Reanimator to help heal up these big, powerful vehicles, and a Canoptech Spider in order to give them a Feel No Pain. Only a single Doomsday Arc this time around, so we're not going all in on the triple Doomsday Arc meme, where it's 3 Doomsday Arcs and the Silent King. That army tends to be very powerful when you're up in a straight-up engagement with it. However, the downside being that it does also tend to be a little dicey and kind of straightforward. If you're able to shoot your opponent off the table, you're probably going to win with it. However, if your opponent is able to outmaneuver you or has the damage values to clear through the Doomsday Arcs fairly quickly, it leaves the Silent King by himself a little bit more quickly than you'd like, especially since the Silent King is going to be stealing a lot of the defensive technology that you would normally be trying to keep the Doomsday Arcs alive with, because he is simply the most efficient place for those abilities to be targeted. So this army is going to be focusing a little bit more on the lighter units in addition to that big, strong bulwark in the center of the table. This includes a unit of 5 Flayed Ones, a unit of 6 Locust Destroyers alongside that Locust Lord. So he's going to give them 5+ criticals to get their lethal hits off, and then also the ability to fall back and still shoot. That's a big deal since these Locust Destroyers don't really do anything in melee, so once you engage them, we do have the Lord's Blade on the Locust Lord, so there's a little bit of melee punch in there, but it's not really enough to clear out like a whole 5-man unit or something. And so oftentimes these guys will just get engaged and stuck in melee, but having the Demanding Leader active for them is potentially pretty solid. We then have 2 Locust Heavy Destroyers with Enminic Exterminators, a single Enminic Exterminator Locust Heavy Destroyer as a utility unit, 3 Scorpic Destroyers, 2 units of 3 Tomb Blades, as well as 2 Triarch Stalkers. Interestingly, these were taking their heavy Gauss cannons instead of their thermal guns. But regardless of what they're equipped with, they're going to be able to strip cover from their target and operate as fast scouting vehicles that can perform actions and act as utility in the early game, and then provide some fire support as the game moves on. Now, moving on from that, we also have our second place player here who also went undefeated here. This was Sebastian Mueller, who went undefeated with a Dark Angels version of a Gladius task force. Now, Sebastian's list is a little bit of a blast from the past. This Gladius variety of Dark Angels has been played in some form, basically since the Dark Angels update that occurred about midway through last year, that improved the attack characteristic of things like Deathwing Knights and Inner Circle companions, and that is what we're seeing played here. But we do have some spicy inclusions. That includes Lionel Johnson, and the army is focusing very heavily on being a really, really powerful mid-board brick of powerful melee infantry, and Lionel Johnson can support that style of army very effectively. So this includes Asriel. He has an Inner Circle companion unit that he can join into in order to give an invulnerable save and sustained hits to. We have a Lieutenant in Phobos armor who can potentially just bodyguard for Lionel Johnson or just act as a utility unit, alongside a Blade Guard Ancient. Now, there aren't any units for the Blade Guard Ancient to join into, so I believe that he's only being included as simply the cheapest objective holder that the faction has access to. He's 45 points, he brings you a single OC1 model, he can potentially attack 6 times in melee if he wants to, but he's not equipped with any special melee weapons, so he's just punching. And he doesn't even get the benefit of his leadership ability. I think he is simply here as a utility unit to go do an action and then maybe die. The downside is that he is a character, so he is potentially giving up assassination. So there are going to be some instances where it is unfortunate that he has that character keyword, but being 20-ish points cheaper than the next cheapest option, that is a price that I think we're willing to pay here. We then have an Assault Jump Pack Intercessor unit for a utility, 3 units of 5 Deathwing Knights. Those guys are all equipped with maces alongside their great weapons on the Knight Master. We have 2 Gladiator Lancers to punch through enemy armored vehicles. These are especially good if you're expecting to see things like opposing Space Marines, because they act as a little bit of a silver bullet to units like Vindicators and Ballistic Dreadnoughts that we've been seeing fairly often. Having that big access to AP4, potentially AP5, ignore cover, with an impressive consistent damage output from that Laser Destroyer makes them very good against opposing Marine profiles, although the downside obviously is that if you're playing against enemies with a lot of invulnerable saves, they do fall down quite a bit. We then also have a single Invader ATV. This is the next cheapest option for a utility unit that's not OC0 servitors in the faction, alongside that Blade Guard Ancient, so this guy is just coming and hanging out, doing some damage with an Onslaught Gatling Cannon and completing some secondaries for just 60 points, which is a great points value, alongside a single Scout Squad for a forward operator. Pretty nice to see that these varieties of Terminator brick-centric Dark Angels are still viable, and they are still seeing play. It's really cool to see Lionel Johnson also get played in there. He can kind of move up the middle of the table with the Deathwing Knights. Getting access to Advance and Charge from Assault Doctrine is huge for him, and being able to heroically intervene and fight first, and to any enemies that are trying to engage the Deathwing Knight brick makes them super hard to deal with, not to mention the fact that he can also slight CP tax your opponent with his ability, or give your army protection against mortal wounds, which is a good way to knock down Deathwing Knights if you have them as well. So there's a good internal synergy there. It is wildly expensive. The Deathwing Knights and Lionel Johnson is over half the cost of the army, but it is very effective and very difficult to engage into profitably. Now with that, we're going to move over to Spain and talk about the Moguer Iberian Open. This was a 34-player GT and was won by Jose Luis Barragan Mateos, who was running World Eaters. Now it's cool to see World Eaters do well. This is a very standard version of World Eaters, however, so I will warn you about that. That includes Angron, Lord Invocatus, and a Berzerker Glaive Master of Executions. Now interestingly, there isn't an attachment unit for the Master of Executions. There's no Berserkers in the army whatsoever. We've replaced them with Jackals this time around. That doesn't mean he won't get access to his fight first, but he is equipped with the Berzerker Glaive, so he is getting that additional attack and damage. And with full hit and wound rerolls targeting enemy character unit, he can kind of just act as a little bit of a character assassin, which I think is what he's doing in this particular list. We have 4 units of Jackals to act as utility. I think these guys are absolutely crucial for World Eaters. They can trade into light enemy units without having to commit big bricks like 8-bound or Angron himself. They do just enough damage, especially if you can dump a couple buffs in there from Blessings of Khorne to clear out enemy light utility stuff, or even just bother bigger units with their special Mauler Blades and Skull Smashers. And they have Obsac and can screen out your backline, so enemies can't drop things like Inceptors on you and absolutely ruin the 8-bound before they're able to commit to the battle. We also have a World Eater's Rhino. This can either carry a couple of Jackals to the fight, or even just to deliver the lone Master of Executions, because he can start embarked within it. So that gives him a little bit of a ride up to the fight, and then on top of that, it can also act as a utility unit as well alongside those Jackals. So A lot of interesting ways to use this little thing. In addition to that, we then have our standard brick of 8-bound, 2 units of 3 standard 8-bound alongside 3 units of 3 exalted 8-bound. Lord of Nokotis is also in the list to give some of these guys scout if we need it, so we can project that threat way up in the center of the table or in the early game. And then for some utility, we have a single chaos spawn. Little bit of interesting technology here with the mass jackals as well as that lone master of executions, but generally speaking, pretty standard World Eater stuff. Now with that, we're going to stay with Chaos Space Marines for a moment here and discuss the Dutch Masters. This was a 70-player event played in the Netherlands, and we did see Chaos Demons go undefeated with it with a Legion of Excess, but we also saw Death Guard go undefeated, and interestingly, with the new Grodsmith detachment, Flyblown Host. I've been waiting to see some success from Flyblown Host ever since it came out. It seems like all of the undefeated lists that we're talking about with Death Guard since that update drop have almost entirely been using Plague Company, their standard index detachment, so it's cool to see the new stuff see some play. Now, the detachment itself gives all of its not embarked infantry 5-inch scout as well as stealth, and we have some ways to make that infantry more difficult to kill. So we're forcing a lot of very resilient infantry units down our opponent's throats in this detachment. In the army, we've included a Biologus Putrefier with the Plague Veil. This will grant an 18-inch lone operative effect to his attached unit as long as he is controlling an objective. We have 2 Terminator Sorcerers. One of them is equipped with Insectile Murmuration to give his unit reroll wounds of 1, targeting enemies within contagion range. A Foul Blightspawn, Typhus, as well as Mortarion, the big man himself. Following that up, we have a unit of Plague Marines for that Biologus Putrefier to join into and make unshootable in the early game. We have 2 units of Death Shroud Terminators, 6 in each of those, likely to attach our Terminator Sorcerers into to protect them in melee. We then have 2 Fetid Bloat Drones for a little bit of fast utility, 2 Mephitic Blight Haulers. These guys are in here not only for their capacity to shoot at other tank targets and do fairly well, but also for Mephitic Invigoration, which will give a transhuman effect, a -1 to wound penalty if the attacker's strength is higher than the target's toughness, to infantry 6 inches away from them for a command point, so they can potentially be -1 to be hit and wounded on these infantry units, which does make them very sticky to remove. We then have our pièce de résistance here, 60 Poxwalkers, 3 units of 20. These guys are already kind of annoying to kill. They're a toughness value of 4, which these style of mass kind of zombie hordes don't tend to be, and with a 5+ feel no pain, that can compound with these -1 to hit and wound effects very effectively. We also have Typhus in the list, so he can join into one of these and apply another -1 to hit effect, and also give them the capacity to regenerate models into the unit more easily. Last, and also maybe least, we have a unit of 3 Nurglings to ensure that we can take up some real estate in the center of the table outside the deployment zone, and stop enemies from being able to movement block the 5-inch scout that the army gets access to. And with that, we'll move over to Montreal, Quebec, and talk about the Abyss Bonne Année, a 28-player GT that was won by John Winter Russell running his Astra Militarum. John was running the Bridgehead Strike Detachment, pretty controversial one that's been getting a lot of discussion since the new Astra Militarum Codex was announced. It seems to be that we are using the index rules for this detachment. I don't know how much it's going to change once the Codex comes out, but we do have some units that looks like they are going to be legended, so take this result with a bit of a grain of salt. That includes a Death Corps Marshal. We're also taking Gaunt's Ghosts in here, and 3 Militarum Tempestus command squads, one of them with the Bombast class Fox Array to triple out that Tempestor Prime's orders. We then have a platoon command squad as well as Ursula Creed. Following that up, we have a unit of 20 Death Corps of Krieg to attach that Marshal into. He's going to grant them a Feel No Pain, they can regenerate themselves and potentially engage enemies in melee, then call in artillery on their position to kill both themselves and the enemy, then regenerate their own casualties, so you don't really lose that much there. We have 4 units of Tempestus Scions, 1 unit of 5, and 3 units of 10. They do gain battle line because our Warlord is a Tempestor Prime, so you can take up to 6 of them, and they get their OC bonus as well, so they become OC2. And obviously, they are the headliners of this detachment. When they come out of reserve, they're able to get +1 to wound from the detachment ability, in addition to their own baked-in hit rerolls, any additional bonuses you get from orders, and the sustained hits from their attached Tempestor Primes. We have 2 Torox Primes. These things are going to embark these 2 units of Kazarkin. They're also included in the army to give them a 6-inch scout effect, and then obviously benefit them with their fire support, in addition to +1 to wound for disembarking a transport. We have a unit of Attilan Rough Riders alongside 3 Mortar Team Heavy Weapons squads to add a little bit of screen clearing so we can drop our big powerful Tempestus Scion bricks out of Deep Strike, a single Ogren Bodyguard alongside 2 units of Tempestus Aquilons. Altogether, relatively standard stuff for Bridgehead Strike, not too much new to see here, although the Torox Prime mounted Kazarkin units is pretty cool. Now with that, we'll go ahead and discuss briefly the headliner of this weekend, the LVO 2025 40k Champions. This was an over 1,000 player super duper major, ultra major, I guess. Maybe we need a brand new classification of events for the LVO, but the world's largest event every year. This time it was just over 1,050 players, and this one was won by Mark Hurdle playing Deathwatch. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I have an entire separate video where I discuss all of the top 8 armies. I will apologize here. In that video, I do make a slight typo in this list in particular, so it is funny that it did go undefeated. When I was copying down the list, I wrote down that it has a Stormspeeder Hammer Strike, but it has a Stormspeeder Thunder Strike to grant it +1 to wound against monsters and vehicles. I think I said it right in my commentary, but I don't think my list transcription was correct. But in short, Mark was playing a Black Spear Task Force. This was led by a Captain in Gravis armor with the Tome of the Ectoclade, so he gets 2 Oath of Moment targets on the big turn where he's going to drop his whole army, alongside a Judiciary with Thief of Secrets to buff him up, a Combi Weapon Lieutenant, and a Watchmaster, alongside 3 units of Deathwatch Veterans, 2 units of 5, and a unit of 10, 2 Rhinos to carry those guys around in, 2 independent Deathwatch Terminator squads just for their efficiency and ability to bring lots of Cyclone missile launchers to the table, a big Indomitor kill team. These guys are awesome for their ability to gain additional strength when targeting the closest enemy unit. The fact that they bring lots of very powerful long-range guns is huge as well. You can use Kraken bolts to extend their range NAP even farther, attacking at 36 to 42 inches with most of their big guns, and then acting as a big defensive bulwark on the crackback. Although concentrated heavy infantry sweeping will kill them pretty effectively, they do get access to free strats like Armor of Contempt from their attached Gravis Captain. We then also have that Stormspeeder Thunder Strike that is important because a lot of the stuff is going to be firing kind of mid-strength attacks downrange that they're then going to buff up with their special issue ammunition stratagems. So getting access to +1 to wound can make things like this Talon Strike kill team go insane. When you're +1 to wound against a monster or vehicle from that Thunder Strike, it turns its 15 Assault Bolter shots to wounding most vehicles in the game on 4s or 5s. Alongside their Twin Linked, their sustained 2 and potentially even lethal hits from Mission Tactics, and their +1 AP from Deep Striking from the Talon Strike kill team ability, alongside an additional either +1 AP or Ignore Cover from Special Issue Ammunition. These things go absolutely ham. You all might also be piling in a little bit of damage from the Thunder Strike itself, and that allows the Talon Strike kill team to kill heavy targets pretty effectively. In addition to that, you can also just use them to sweep infantry, which is really their intended play pattern, but once they're buffed up, they're basically the best recipient of buffs in the entire faction. The finals of the LVO Championships saw these 5 Assault Bolter Talon Strike Inceptors alongside 6 Assault Bolter Inceptors on the Ultramarine side of the table from Ben Neal, Mark Hurdle's opponent in the finals there, and there were also 6 more Plasma Inceptors in the Ultramarines list as well. Inceptors were getting a lot of play in that finals game. That data sheet turns out real strong. That said, the finals game was very, very dominating in favor of Deathwatch. Mark Hurdle was able to deliver an absolutely fatal Alpha Strike to his Ultramarine opponent that killed most of the effective units in their army in one go, right at the top of turn 2, which was fairly shocking and made the finals a little bit anticlimactic, but did showcase the power of this Black Spear Task Force. The ability to keep a couple units in reserve, things like these Terminators that can just start in Deep Strike, as well as teleport up to 2 kill team units up on the table and deliver Deathwatch Veterans inside Rhinos, potentially this big unit even advancing and charging thanks to that attached Watchmaster. This army's able to bring a ton of pressure to wherever whenever it needs to on the battlefield, anytime it needs to. While the Deathwatch profiles themselves are fairly middling until they get buffed by their stratagems or units like the Thunderstrike, the fact that they can apply those attacks essentially anywhere they need to makes the faction in the hands of a good player absolutely lethal. And it's cool to see Deathwatch having their time in the sun again after a long period of being really bad and or not even existing as the faction in the game. So with that, those are all of the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Let me know down in the comment section which one is your favorite. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.